So that people here can get an idea of the flavour and tone of what you do, perhaps, I wonder if you could talk briefly about a project you have at the moment in development with Peter Strickland called the Barbarian Sound Studio, which is a sort of David Lynch-ish, Dario Argento-ish kind of territory, low budget.
It's an interesting one to talk about.
European in approach.
Well, it's European in flavour. In a way, it sort of shows both sides, actually, in that it's part of the sort of Warp expansion happening in Warp Europe, in that it's just briefly, it's a project that is from Peter Strickland, who directed Katalin Varga, which was a phenomenal film that came out last year, and he won the Best Newcomer Award at the European Film Academy. And his second film, which is being produced with Keith Griffiths and through Warp, is called the Barbarian Sound Studio, and is an experimental, I think you'd say, horror film in a kind of Lynchian type way about a British sound engineer who goes to Italy, gets a job in Italy, and discovers, to his horror, on arriving, that it is one of the sound studios that does all of the sound effects for the Dario Argento type extreme horror films, and discovers that there's something.
Euro pudding, it's Euro splatter.
It's Euro splatter, absolutely, yes. Perhaps back to the sheep farming, it's abattoirs and killings. What's interesting about it is that it's being, in part, put together as a quite classic European co-production. Broadcaster in the UK, Film 4, regional funding, subsidy funding in Italy, Hungary, Germany, to be announced, and so on and so forth. But it's being put together in a way that isn't necessarily thinking about it just as a feature film. First of all, one of the reasons it came to us is that Peter is a huge fan of Warp and has been for years, and is also a musician. And in a sense, and I know everybody says this about films and usually it's bullshit, but in this case it is true, the soundtrack is as important as the film. And he has started a collaboration with a band called Broadcast, that's one of Warp's most successful acts at the moment, to completely collaborate on the whole design of the sound from beginning to end. And of course, one of the things that we can benefit from is the fact that, being based around Italian horror, there's no reason to worry about sync sound. In fact, in order to be true, sound must be as out of sync as possible. So that gives you enormous leeway. But it also opens up the fact that in some ways the soundtrack is potentially as much of an event as the film. You can look at the film and you can sort of see it as Broadcast does a soundtrack for Peter Strickland, or you can say Peter Strickland does visuals for Broadcast, and it's a genuine collaboration. And it means when you think about bringing that film out, you don't necessarily think, blimey, how are we going to pre-sell a rather experimental, not necessarily totally horrific, atmospheric horror film that's three-quarters in Italian, which might lead you to wonder why you were making it. Instead, you can go, isn't this enormously exciting? You said we had to be upbeat, so I'm being upbeat. Yeah, good. Isn't this enormously exciting? We have a huge fan base for Broadcast. We have a cult fan base for Peter. We have something that, of course, will be a wonderful film, and which we believe will be coming to a cinema near you in probably about a year's time, but which can be shown in other ways.
Exactly. Now, that's the point I wanted to raise. And two things. First of all, at 700,000, 750k, with a possible, not guaranteed license fee from Film 4, but certainly the possibility of doing business because of your first look deal with them, it's a risk that is perhaps of a different risk profile from what we were talking about earlier. But also, going back to this point about the way in which you merge the DNA of the music aspect of Warp with cinema. Can you tell us a bit more about how you approach the commercialization of this film? So I think for this you had a plan of treating it more like a sort of,
all of this
like live music.
Yeah, in a way. I mean, these are plans in discussion. So in a way, they're not confidential because none of them are settled yet. But the discussion that's being had, and it's something that we've looked at and indeed done on some of our previous films. We did a film called All Tomorrow's Parties that was about the festival. This is a bit of a digression, but it illustrates the point. And that film didn't have a conventional cinema release in the UK. It was toured around the UK like a concert. It was toured with bands. In fact, All Tomorrow's Parties is a festival that takes place in what do you call them? Holiday camps. And so the tour of the All Tomorrow Parties movie was themed like a holiday camp. When I saw it in Edinburgh, there were people riding donkeys down Princes Street, and literally redcoats inviting you into the cinema. And yes, you could have candy floss, and yes, there was a wet T-shirt competition and a knobbly knee competition, and there was a film, and there were bands. And every single one of those dates sold out. And one of the things that's been much talked about with 3D and Avatar and so on and so forth is the sort of putting the eventness back into cinema. And clearly, as independents, we can't compete with that sort of technological might. But what you can, I believe, do is still offer a unique experience. And it might be on a smaller scale, but it can still be, the most unique thing about social experiences is the social aspect of them. It's that you happen to be standing next to that person watching that thing. It's not to do with technology, which is inherently reproducible. And we've been talking with Peter and with some other sources about a notion of Barbarian, potentially existing in a conventional cinema release, but also existing as a live touring show. Almost like an opera. And we're in discussions with a couple of large international music and theatre festivals about a staged version of it where you actually walk into something that is like a sound studio, and yes, there is the film playing, and yes, there is broadcast playing, but there are also people from the film within it, and it's a little bit like walking into a video game. Actually, there is an interactive game environment, except it's real, with real people in it. And interestingly, that proposition as something that could run for a week or 2 weeks in certain venues and then could tour to other cities is potentially easier to finance than financing the film or to getting MGs for the film itself.
Thank you, and I think we'll come back later on, the three of you, if I may, on the issue of windows, the issue of territoriality of rights, which are relevant and germane to your business. I'd like to turn to Carl. The Works has been renowned as a company that has managed to handle that ugly word specialty movies successfully in a difficult market for decades now. Have you been brought in to perhaps bring it a little bit more into the mainstream? Is the road to survival to diversify away from the smaller scale movie and go into more commercial, quote-unquote, propositions?
Yes, and I would echo what Peter was saying about sort of leaving that very dangerous territory of the sort of the kitchen sink drama. Indeed, the word drama is something that distributors will tell you they don't handle. It's kind of a ridiculous thing to say, but that's it. What Peter was saying as well about the kind of eventizing movies, I think that's incredibly important, from the high end where David is, down to the lower end of the scale. And indeed, we had a documentary called Anvil, where there was this thing called the Anvil Experience, where the band played for 15 minutes after a screening. They did this a lot in the UK and in the US. And in its way, that was an event. And I think that films have to be an event. You have to sort of imagine people deciding to get off their sofas and paying whatever it costs to see the movie and spend the 4 hours round trip to go and see it. And I think if you can't sort of see the eventness in the film that you're considering, then you should probably pass on it. But yes, I mean the Works has a reputation for a certain kind of film, and the last thing I want to do is to sort of turn my back or the company's back on some of the better examples and the interesting names, the Loaches and the Shane Meadowses and so on. These are brands in a way, and a Loach movie is an event. So the Works isn't about sort of not doing those films anymore, but considerably less of the more marginal product perhaps that it has had, because you simply can't sustain a business on that. And my background is in more commercial fare, and so I am sort of looking to push relationships and push us into the realm where the pre-sale becomes possible again. And the good news is that the right film will pre-sell these days. The market seems to be re-engaging for certain kinds of films.